Peter, is it? For 2,000 years, he's been kind of the butt of those sorts of things. The name of tonight's episode of the video we're going to see is called Condemned by the Righteous. That's kind of the terrible irony of this whole story of Jesus. Jesus wasn't killed by the bad people. He wasn't killed by the evil people. He was executed by the good people, by the high priest, the scribes, the elders, all the best and the brightest, the people who were supposed to mete out justice fairly. Those are the ones who condemned Jesus. They were kind of like their Supreme Court justices for the Jewish people in Jerusalem. They were supposed to be the fairest of the fair. And these righteous condemned an innocent man. So how did this happen? The Sanhedrin, this group of people, was made up of 71 men. It goes back to the Old Testament where Moses was getting overwhelmed, he was getting overworked, and he asked for help. And God said, choose 70 people to kind of help you with all this work that you're doing. And so this has kind of been handed on ever since then, since Moses' time. So these 71 people in the Sanhedrin. And it was no secret all through Jesus' ministry that they really didn't like Jesus and his message. You know that. And they didn't like his actions all that much either. He was kind of against all of their principles of law. He was Jewish, he was upholding the law, but in a way they really didn't care for. And he was dangerous, because everyone knew Rome is watching everything we do. And so they have this trial in the middle of the night. They're never supposed to have a trial in the middle of the night. It's always supposed to be during the day. And it was also a holiday. They never met during holidays, but for some reason, in the middle of the night, they're all there. They're going to have this secret trial. And they start interviewing witnesses. And it takes 2 witnesses to agree before you can convict somebody. And they could not get two witnesses to agree to what this guy had done. And it looked like if Jesus played his cards right, he could still walk. He could still get out of here with it, intact. And then Caiaphas, the high priest, in desperation, he threw a Hail Mary pass. He got right in Jesus' face and he says, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" And Jesus could have said nothing. He hadn't said anything yet. But instead of saying nothing, he chose to give them the truth. He chose to tell them the news that they had been waiting 1,000 years or more to hear. In Greek, he said, ego eimi. In English, it's I am. Remember the name for God that God gave to Moses? I am. I am who I am. I will choose whom I will choose. I will be whomever I want to be. Here he is. The one they've been waiting for, praying for, right in front of them. The Messiah. And Jesus wanted nothing more in that moment than to welcome them into his kingdom. At one point he talks about taking them under his wings like a hen gathers her chicks. And what happens? Caiaphas, the high priest, yells, "Blasphemy!" And he starts tearing off his clothes. He's so angry. He's in this rage. And he says, "You all heard it. What's your verdict? We got our witnesses now. You heard it. What do you say?" Guilty. And so the very ones looking for this Messiah reject him when he's right there in front of them. He wasn't the type of Messiah they were looking for. I mean, everyone was looking for a great king who was going to ride in and make their country great again, all that kind of stuff. And Jesus was not that. And their righteousness blinded them. Do you see how our righteousness can be even more dangerous than our evil sometimes? Our worldview can get us in big trouble. I mean, the irony of this story is always that the good people crucified Jesus. the ones who always stood up for God, the ones who always stood up for tradition and for the law of Moses and for the prophets, they're the ones who made this happen. How could they get it so wrong? Not only miss the Messiah, but kill him, and thinking they're doing a service to their country in the process. Well, Peter, he's outside. I mean, he's got to be the bravest of all the disciples, right? I mean, he's the one who, well, first of all, he chopped off one of the guy's ear. He's the one who drew his sword. Anger issues, yeah. He's also the one who dared to follow Jesus all the way to the house of Caiaphas, the high priest. He's the one who dared to sneak into the courtyard and be around that fire and kind of watch what's going on and see maybe we can rescue him. Maybe we can do something to help him here. Until he was recognized by that servant girl. And she asks, "Are you one of his guys?" If you ask me, it was perfectly logical to say no at that point, don't you think? I mean, it's just kind of simple self-preservation. And what good is it going to do him to get arrested at this point? He's there to help Jesus. He's got to kind of stay in the shadows and kind of watch. He can't just say, "Yes, I'm him." And as soon as he says it, cock-a-doodle-doo, he denies his Messiah. What else could he do? We look at what Jesus did. I suppose he could have told this girl about Jesus, give her a chance to hear the good news. No, it's pretty risky. The story ends with Peter weeping. The priests and the scribes and the elders, they're spitting and hitting, and the night of torture is beginning. In 3 days, everything's going to change, and it's going to take your breath away, the change that's going to happen. Peter's weeping will become forgiveness and joy. And he will never, ever deny his Lord again. He will even be crucified upside down rather than deny his Lord. And the priests and the scribes and the elders, they're going to continue fighting Jesus and the followers of Jesus. They will not see this Messiah, not yet. But Paul tells us, one day, every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess that Jesus is Lord and Messiah. And they will see that he really is the one that they've been looking for, waiting for, praying for. Come, Lord Jesus. Come and watch as he is condemned in the irony of ironies by the righteous.
In the earliest centuries, Christians gathered here, and they remembered that Jesus was brought to this place for his trial before the Sanhedrin at night, and they remembered the place where Peter had denied. As we continue our study of the final hours of Jesus' life, we turn to the trial of Jesus before the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council, and the abandonment and denial of Jesus by Simon Peter. As Jesus was praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, Judas Iscariot came, leading a crowd who had come with swords and clubs from the Sanhedrin. It was after midnight. Judas came and kissed his master, a sign that Judas had given to the guards, indicating which man was to be arrested. The disciples reach for their weapons, and Peter slices off the ear of the high priest's slave. But Jesus will have none of this. Luke, the physician, tells us that Jesus heals the servant's ear, while John tells us the name of the man, Malchus, and that it was his right ear. With this, the disciples ran, and Jesus was left alone with the crowd of thugs. The only disciple still with him now was Judas. Bound, Jesus is led back across the Kidron Valley and back up to Mount Zion, to the high priest's home. Now, while in Jerusalem, I found it helpful to make this journey myself. It was about a 20-minute walk for me, and going uphill, it left me winded. Let's get a sense of what this walk was like. This is the path that Jesus would have taken as he was led away from the Garden of Gethsemane and led to the place where he would be tried by the Sanhedrin at night. And so we're on our way up to the city of Zion, and we are passing through the Kidron Valley and to the Church of St. Peter Gallicantu. So this is the path. We've just walked through the Kidron Valley, where Jesus would have been led sometime after midnight with the guards from the temple with their torches, and he would have been taken up here. The disciples all had fled by this time, and when he comes up the Kidron Valley, he comes up the path from the Kidron Valley, he comes out right here at the southern wall of the temple, where he'd taught many times, and near the teaching steps, where he had addressed the disciples and where he had predicted the downfall of Jerusalem. And he continued the journey up the pathway to the lower city of David and finally to the upper city of David, to the house of high priest Caiaphas. It was here that the Sanhedrin was meeting by night so as to not anger the crowds. It was in secret in order to silence Jesus once and for all. Now, the old Roman road still stands here. The Roman steps, and pilgrims who come this way often will take off their shoes so as to walk barefoot on the path that Jesus was walking on, to remember and to mark that last leg of his journey to the high priest's house. And somehow, as I feel these large Roman stones under my feet, I feel myself identifying and really even just wondering, what was Jesus thinking? What was he feeling? Was he winded as I am after making this journey? Was he afraid? Or was he trusting once more in the God who would deliver him? The Church of St. Peter in Gallicantu marks the traditional location of the palace of the high priest Caiaphas and the site of the trial of Jesus before the Sanhedrin. It's built atop ruins that date back to the time of Christ. As with any of the places you might visit in the Holy Land, we cannot know for certain that this is the exact location, but there are interesting features of this site that certainly help us to imagine what Jesus was experiencing on that night. So let's take a closer look at St. Peter in Gallicantu. These ruins, ancient mikvah, that is ritual baths and cisterns, are thought to be the remains of the high priest Caiaphas' home. From the earliest centuries, Christians gathered here, and they remembered that Jesus was brought to this place for his trial before the Sanhedrin at night, and they remembered the place where Peter had denied Jesus 3 times. In 1889, this room was discovered. It had been filled with rubbish for centuries. And as archaeologists began to dig underneath the high priest's house, Caiaphas' home, what they found was evidence that there had been prisoners who were kept here. You see the place where the shackles would have been held, suspending the prisoner by their arms. And as the archaeologists began to uncover this place, they found evidence of Byzantine crosses that very early in the history of the church, Christians came here and they marked the imprisonment and the suffering of Jesus. Some even wondered whether he had been scourged himself before going to Pontius Pilate to be scourged, whether Jesus himself had his arms suspended here that night and was beaten first by the guards of the high priest. And when we read in Acts chapter 5 that Peter and John were imprisoned for their faith because they refused to stop speaking in the name of Jesus, this may very well have been the place where they were kept in prison. In ancient times, prisons were often no more than a pit, a cistern or a dried well dedicated as a prison. People were lowered into them, and if you were to visit the Mamertine prison in Rome, where tradition holds that Peter was in prison before his death, you would find it also as a pit. Under the church at St. Peter in Gallicantu is such a pit, and it's believed that Jesus would have been held in this place from the time that he was tested and questioned before the Sanhedrin until he was turned over to Pilate. Maybe 5, 6, perhaps even 7 hours he spent in this dark place, in this pit. This is the dungeon, the pit where tradition says Jesus was lowered into as he was awaiting the outcome of his trial before the Sanhedrin. He could hear them debating his fate from this place. And as was common in the dungeons of the time, he would have been lowered by a rope placed around his chest, dropped down slowly into this place. He sat here in the darkness that night. And here we remember the words of Psalm 88, where the psalmist writes, "I am counted among those who go down to the pit. I'm like a man without strength. I am set apart with the dead, like the slain who lie in the grave, whom you remember no more, who are cut off from your care. You have put me in the lowest pit, in the darkest depths. And one can't help but wonder if Jesus was pondering these same words as he sat in the darkness in this room. Finally, when the trial was over, the rope was lowered again, and he was drawn out from the pit, and the sentence was passed. He'd be turned over to Pilate to be crucified. All four Gospels tell us that while Jesus was on trial before the Sanhedrin, the other disciples had fled. They were in hiding, except Peter, who followed at a distance as they were bringing Jesus to the home of Caiaphas. Actually, John tells us that he was there as well. We focus on the fact that Peter would deny Jesus 3 times this night, but perhaps we should also remember that only Peter had the courage to actually come to the place Jesus was being tried. He went so far as to enter the courtyard. He was attempting to make good on his promise that though the others would flee, he would not leave Jesus. Here's how Mark tells the story. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she stared at him and said, "You also were with Jesus, the man from Nazareth." But he denied it, saying, "I do not know or understand what you're talking about." And he went out into the forecourt, and then the cock crowed. And the servant girl, on seeing him again, began once more to say to the bystanders, "This man is one of them." But he denied it. Then after a little while, the bystanders again said to Peter, "Certainly you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." But he began to curse, and he swore an oath, "I do not know this man you're talking about." At that moment, the cock crowed for the second time. Then Peter remembered that Jesus had said to him, "Before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." And he broke down and wept. We're standing here at the courtyard of the high priest Caiaphas' house, the courtyard outside of the church at St. Peter Gallicantu. And perhaps my favorite part of this courtyard is the statue that was placed here in 1957. It's a statue of Peter denying 3 times his Lord, and the cock crowing above. And it reminds us, of course, as we stand in this place, that if Peter denied Jesus and was still restored, there's hope for us when we have denied Jesus, when we've turned our backs on him or failed to acknowledge him. If there was hope for Peter, there's hope.